All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. We've got a very big session planned for you today. So without any further ado, let me introduce Kyle Swain from Lpc Cresa. Take it away, Kyle.
Thank you, Beck. Yeah, absolutely a very big session today. Hopefully the topic will be something that assists a lot of you. We're going to deal today with some stuff around the landlord's response that you may have been experiencing and so on. So might just flick through back to the first one, and obviously an important part of being eligible for the Code of Conduct and receiving rent relief from your landlord is to be eligible for the JobKeeper package. So I trust that you are all going through that process, and I came across this little graphic that you might relate to if you've been on the ATO and Treasury websites trying to manoeuvre your way through the JobKeeper stuff. But we'll move through and presume that you are eligible for the JobKeeper package and are now approaching landlords with the request to get appropriate and proportionate rent relief. So today's questions that have been fairly predominant in the last week is, are landlords legally obliged to abide by the principles of the mandatory Code of Conduct? And how do I respond to my landlord if they're not adhering to the code? So I've certainly heard some examples in the past week of landlords acting very much outside of the code and certainly not in good faith in any way and doing some pretty horrific things. We've also heard some great stories of landlords coming to the party and doing the right things. So I just wanted to cover off these two topics as quickly as I can, and obviously it's one that we could present for an hour and a half on. So I'm going to skim through and just try to give you a sense of our thoughts on these things. In looking at the mandatory Code of Conduct, I've put this slide up to show all of the various pieces of legislation that have already been passed into legislation across the states and territories. At the very top, you'll see the National Cabinet Mandatory Code of Conduct for small, medium enterprise commercial leasing principles. That came into effect on April the 8th. And since that time, some landlords have been saying, well, we're waiting until the legislation is in place around that before we'll respond. Some landlords are now acting in good faith based on the mandatory Code of Conduct. The response has been quite varied from landlords. So looking back at the legislation that has been passed since COVID-19 began, you can see in every state and territory there's been at least a bill passed around COVID-19 as a response to the pandemic. Most of those were passed in the last week of March or early April prior to the mandatory Code of Conduct. And most of them relate to a number of different acts in each state and territory, and there'll be one small component of that which deals with the retail leasing or commercial leasing act in that state or territory. ACT, for example, at the top there, the emergency response bill came into effect on April the 2nd. And then on April the 8th, they did an emergency response amendment to the actual Commercial and Retail Act in the ACT. Both of these bills only really addressed the initial principles set out by the National Cabinet at the time, which were that tenants were to receive some protections. The initial things like they're not to be have their leases terminated if they're in financial hardship, and those basic components that were out initially, and based on those initial provisions, the mandatory Code of Conduct was further developed and implemented on April the 8th. Since April the 8th, The only legislation that's come in that deals directly with the Code of Conduct is in WA and New South Wales. So last week on the 23rd and 24th of April, 24th of April, WA legislation and also in New South Wales, the regulation was passed. Now, there's two differences in WA and New South Wales, and we've already experienced with a landlord in New South Wales saying that based on now the regulation, the New South Wales Retail and Other Commercial Leases Regulation 2020, it was assented into Parliament on April 24th, and it was supposedly the first legislation that specifically gave effect to the Code of Conduct. Unfortunately, what it did was said that this commences from April 24th, so we're now experiencing landlords saying they won't pay any rent relief prior to April 24th. The same legislation in WA that was passed last week specifically notes that that legislation comes into effect on April 23rd, I think it was, but Part 2 and Part 3 of the legislation, which is the important parts that deal with the COVID-19 problem and the Code of Conduct principles, comes into effect from March 30. And that is absolutely the intent of the legislation, is to give effect to the Code of Conduct, which applies to the pandemic period, which is defined by the JobKeeper program. The JobKeeper program commencement date is March 30 and the current expiry date is September 27. So those are the dates that the legislation is intended to be enforced for. New South Wales, in my opinion, and please, I'm not a solicitor and this is not a legal opinion, this is just our position as specialists in leasing and retail leasing and understanding these acts in how they play out in negotiations and regulations. So our position is that yes, technically, the New South Wales regulation can give a landlord the right at the moment to not offer any rent relief prior to the date that was assented into New South Wales legislation, being last Thursday. We don't believe that's the intent of it, and we believe that if a landlord is pushing that concept, then it's not really in good faith. But I am aware that Dominic Lamb and the NRA are already working to lobby the New South Wales Parliament to have that rectified. Hopefully that will be the case, and we may need to come back to some of those landlords retrospectively and request that the code and the relevant rental relief be applied to the full period, not just from the 24th of April. It may well be that we need to do that in New South Wales, but our strategy would be to advise the landlord that, yes, while that's technically correct, we don't believe that's the intent, and we don't believe that's the in good faith position of the National Mandatory Code of Conduct as it was presented. So that's a pretty important distinction. There are Victoria is due to go to legislation in the next fortnight. New South Wales, I think, has still got some more work to do when they sit again, 12th of March, I think it is. And the other states may well still put specific legislation in place. WA is working on a code of conduct for small commercial leases, so smaller businesses, in conjunction with the legislation over there. So there's still more to happen. Whichever state you're in, you can look up the legislation as it applies and understand how that impacts on the code of conduct. But our position is, while the landlord's not obligated to abide by the mandatory code of conduct, the expectation is that nationally that will be the case. And hopefully they come to the party in that. If there's a dispute over that, it can certainly be taken to the dispute process. Office of Small Business Commissioner, for example, there is a dispute process being put in place. It's not quite in place yet. So I think that covers off hopefully both the questions, but it may raise a lot of questions in your minds. Can we just I'm going to open up to questions, but on the next slide, I've just, while people are asking questions, we're answering. What I've put on this slide for you to have a look at is an example of tenant representative strategic approach to the post-COVID-19 lease negotiations. There may be a lease event like a lease renewal or a market rent review that you have coming up in the next 6 to 12 months. And I've just made a list here of some interesting points right at the moment, data that's already coming out that will play a significant role on what the market rents are in 12 to 18 months and 6 to 12 months. And there's a bit of a step-by-step there on looking at one particular aspect that we believe will impact on market rents in that period, and some pros and cons of that may impact on all of us. But I'm not going to talk to that because I think there'll be a lot of questions around the topic of today. But you may want to take that information away with you for later consideration. Beck, can we go to questions and see what's come out of that?
All right, so I'm assuming everyone's still busy digesting and typing what you've said.
Yeah, that was a lot.
We've got the first one come through, so that's great. I'll also just take this opportunity while everyone is thinking of their questions. The NRA, we have developed a COVID-19 impact survey to help us find exactly how COVID-19 has impacted our retailers. This is going to be incredibly important for us as we do our submission for annual wage review, which will be in July. So please, everyone, if you have 10 minutes, please click the link in the chat and help us help you. So we've got our first question from John. Hi, Kyle. Surely a landlord claim that rent relief only starts from an enactment date is against the intention of good faith negotiations and shared pain.
Yes, and that's what I was conveying, is that would certainly be our response to that landlord, and we would recommend you take that same approach. The code is very strong on both parties acting in good faith. We certainly take the opinion that if a landlord is pushing that argument, which clearly isn't the intent of the mandatory code, we don't believe is the intent of that regulation in New South Wales, then really that's not acting in good faith, and we would try to have them see that and understand that and return to good faith discussions. But failing that, as I said, we would certainly wait until that regulation is rectified, that commencement date, and retrospectively seek that rent relief as well.
Okay, great. We've got a question from Tom. What date the Code of Conduct has become effective in South Australia? Is it retrospective and include the month of March, as our sales were severely impacted from the 14th of March?
Yeah, no. Yes, COVID-19 impacts started to be felt from mid-March, and many businesses felt it significantly from the 22nd or 23rd of March, which was the date that mandatory closures occurred in the health and fitness sector, the fast casual dining and restaurants. They were deeply impacted in the last 7 to 10 days of the month, and we would certainly like that period to be covered. But the Code of Conduct was pretty clear that it defines the pandemic period as being defined by the time frame covered by the JobKeeper program, and that came into effect on April 3rd. But the JobKeeper program is March 30. So to split the difference, we're essentially negotiating rent relief for the period from April 1st through till the end of the JobKeeper program as the pandemic period. And then after that, there's other work to occur. That's the reasonable recovery period that is also undefined.
Lovely. So I've got a question from Mark. How does the code apply to tenancies which are on month-to-month holdover? What strategies are suggested when negotiating with landlords for leases on holdover?
Yeah, the code indicates that reasonable consideration should be given to the situation around the lease, whether it's in holdover, whether it's the business in administration and various things like that. So it does cover it in respect to giving due consideration to that situation. In our experience so far, that's used by both sides as leverage for moving forward. Obviously, a landlord with the current outlook would be keen to secure you as a tenant for another lease term, and a part of those negotiations would be the relief that they provide now. So it would certainly act in your favour in that respect. But if you want to remain on holdover, then it just comes down to negotiation with your landlord for that period. And I would suggest that you would get more relief if you entered into a new lease, but that may not be the best decision right now. So someone like a tenant representative like Lpc Cresa would look pretty closely at your past performance, the lease terms, what the landlord is proposing. But in the first instance, you should certainly be progressing as though you had secure tenure under a lease and full coverage of the code of conduct and seeking rent relief on that basis.
Okay, great. I've had a message from Hillary. Hi, can you please give an example with numbers on how the rent is calculated according to the code? Say, for example, if the rent is $10,000 per month.
Sure. It is quite simple, actually. Rent $10,000 per month. If your turnover last year was $100,000 in April, and this April it's $50,000, you've been impacted by $50,000, which is 50%. So you should get a discount on your rent of 50%. So you should only pay $5,000 in rent. Now, the other $5,000, as a minimum, 50% of that needs to be waived. So you just delete that off the ledger, never to be recovered by the landlord, never to be paid by you. The other $2,500 is as deferred rent, and this is the minimum requirement. Preferably all $5,000 would be waived and you never have to repay it. Most landlords are trying to stick to the 50% and 50%. So the $2,500 would be accumulated as a deferred amount, and once this period is over, and that might be 3 months of that, so $7,500 will then be divvied up in equal instalments over a minimum 24-month period, and that's a part of the negotiation as to when that starts and for how long. If you got 4 years left on your lease, you can spread it over 4 years. If you got only 18 months on your lease, they may want to extend your lease by 6 months so that it's over the 24 months. But by agreement, you might choose to pay it off over 18 months. But that's how it's calculated, and hopefully that is quite clear.
Thank you, Kyle. A question from Shivji. I was told by my lease executive that mandatory code only applies for tenancies with at least 24 months left in the lease. Is that true?
No, it applies to all leases. The 24-month component of the code of conduct is the repayment period. So, as I was just saying on that last question, if you have less than 18 months left on your lease term, your option is to extend the lease term so that you can pay off smaller chunks over that minimum of 24 months. There's nothing stopping you by agreement with the landlord to pay off any deferred amount of rent over a shorter period so that you don't have to renew your lease. That would allow you to renew at a later date when possibly rents may be cheaper and you can negotiate a better lease rather than locking into a longer period now so that you can pay it off over 24 months, but you'll be paying higher rent or the current rent, which may be higher than it may be down the track, which is why I've put that slide up around the effect of petrol pricing and oil prices on CPI and what that's going to do to rent and our general economy over the next 12, 18 months. So, no, if you have a current lease, the Code of Conduct applies to you. It's just a negotiation around the repayment of any deferred amount of rent that applies.
Okay. Well, our chat hasn't had any new questions come in, so please, everyone in attendance, I encourage you to take this time to ask Kyle any questions. He certainly knows his stuff. So, Kyle, if maybe you just wanted to talk a little bit further about CPI and sort of what that recovery period will look like.
Sure. So, we've indicated a few times, and that last question shows the importance of this. You need to make smart decisions now and strategic decisions now about establishing what your business is going to be post-COVID-19, how viable it's going to be. And the decisions you make now will impact on your business performance later on. If you've got a lease particularly that expires within that 2-year period, then there may be pressure on you from a landlord to extend the lease so that you can repay a deferred amount over that expected minimum period of 24 months. Whereas we might advise that you don't extend the lease because macroeconomic factors like this and some microeconomic factors around the particular market that you operate in may currently are indicating that rents should be much softer, and negotiating rents in most categories in 12 months would probably be, most likely, our expectation is that they will be reduced compared to current market rents. And the slide that we put up is showing why we believe that in one aspect. And a part of our strategic approach to negotiating short, medium and long-term outcomes for your lease and critical events that are coming up in your lease cycle is looking at things like this. So when the price of oil has dropped to a quarter of what it was, it's about $20 a barrel. That impacts on the tax that's paid, fuel taxes. It drops the price of petrol more. There's an indication that petrol prices will drop further than what they are right now even, which is great for driving around right now, but it has some negative impact of that as well. And if our interest rates were up at 8 or 9%, then the Feds could knock some off the interest rates and generate some inflationary activity to try to stabilise that. They would like to keep CPI between 2 and 3%, but all indications are that we'll finish the year with a negative CPI and not much ability to impact on that and increase it. Short-term effect of that is that if you have a lease annual increase coming up just after the COVID-19 period and it's a CPI increase, it's probably not going to increase your rent. Longer term, the effect of a negative CPI is that general spend is going to decrease. Retailers start to get competitive on pricing. That costs you gross profit margin, so you get GP erosion. That impacts your business, and all of those things soften rents, essentially. So hopefully that kind of explains the sorts of factors that go into a specialist tenant representative working with you on negotiating the short, medium and long-term aspects of your lease around your business.
Certainly. And well, I know I've had mixed feelings myself at the Bowser, enjoying the price but not liking what it means. We've had a few more questions come in while you're explaining some more there. From Tom, if the store is closed and there are no sales, is it zero rent in any given month?
That essentially the impact in that case is that 100% impact. The landlords are certainly negotiating in those situations, putting strong pressure on the business to reopen. So the only ones that have a sound argument in that case are the ones that were mandated by the government to close. So certain categories, so health and fitness, for example, are not allowed to reopen. Everyone else that has closed, and we're talking over 120 national retail brands, and some of those are talking about reopening on March 11. Some are fast casual dining businesses that felt that a combination of financial and health and safety factors required that they close. Landlords are essentially putting pressure on those businesses to reopen, to get centres activated again, and get business happening again. If it's going to be a negotiation on your part, and really, if you are not comfortable that you would be fulfilling your duty of care to employees and things like that, then you're justified in closing, in my view. But it's a negotiation with the landlord, and ongoing. If they apply 100% rent relief while you're closed, they will certainly want you to reopen as soon as possible for that goodwill to continue.
Okay. Our next question, can a landlord charge you interest on the deferred rent?
No, that's mandated in the code that there's no interest on that.
It's a nice, easy one. Teresa asks, what justification can we use to try and get the landlord to increase the amount of waived rent? They are sticking to the 50-50 at the moment and do not seem willing to increase any further. We were thinking of offering 75% waived and zero deferred.
Yeah, look, that's one strategy, giving up some so that overall the landlord gets some rent now. It's all about cash flow. So if you understand what the driver is for the landlord, then you can devise a compelling argument that may get somewhere with them. They either get 25% improvement on their cash flow now, or they recover 50% later on. That may work for some landlords, particularly smaller ones, owner investors, mum and dad investors and so on may want that cash flow now. So that strategy could work. Really, the only strategy we have is the compelling argument that around the belief that most business failures will occur once they restart or start paying back that deferred amount. When you consider most retail businesses are financially distressed pre-COVID-19, certainly not sitting on months and months of cash flow. Many are operating month to month. Occupancy costs as a ratio of turnover is significantly higher than it should be prior to COVID-19. As soon as you come out of COVID-19 into the reasonable recovery period and reach the date where it's agreed that you'll start repaying the deferred amount, and you put that amount on top of your full lease obligation rent, we're in a situation where turnover is not likely to be back to 100%, and you may be experiencing some profit erosion, as we point out with the situation around CPI and the effect of that. Overall, you're going to be squeezed more and more, and the compelling argument for landlords is that the intent of the Code of Conduct is not only to get businesses reopen at the end of the period, but for both businesses to come out the other side as viable going concerns. So the landlord should still be solvent and able to manage their asset, and the tenant should have a business that is able to continue to trade. If there's a high percentage, if there's 50% of deferred rent, for a lot of retailers will mean, once they start repaying it, will mean that their businesses fail. That's the compelling argument. The landlord has a choice now to ensure they get their rent for the remainder of the lease term by looking after you now and after COVID, or risk your business failing and be in a market conditions where they may have significant difficulty reletting that same space to a new tenant, and certainly not for the same rent. It will certainly cost them a fairly significant incentive to secure a new tenant, and they may be sitting on a vacant tenancy for some months in that situation. So it's about selling a compelling argument as to why it's in the landlord's benefit to provide that rent relief as waived rent rather than the minimum requirement of 50 and 50.
Thank you, Kyle. It's 1:30 now, but we'll go one final question. This comes from Mark. The code does not make it clear whether relief applies to base rent only or gross rent, which is base rent, outgoings, and promo levy. Is there anything that tenants can point to that says the code should apply to gross rent?
No, and I can't cite any specific principle or item in there off the top of my head. I would even need to go back and check a few things, but I think the intent is that it's base rent. Our position as tenant representatives is that that's the fair and the fair position to take. The landlord doesn't make profit on outgoings. They're costs for them to own that business or to own that asset. Where their profit is in the rent. That's their revenue. And we believe it's fair and equitable to share the pain in that respect only, base rent, not their fixed costs. However, how the code does address that and why we believe the code is the intent of the code is rent relief around base rent. It talks about rent, and rent is base rent. Gross rent involves landlord costs of owning the asset, and it's addressed in the code where it talks about if the landlord receives any benefits or discounts or anything like the land tax incentives that are coming out, then those costs should also be passed on to the tenant. So I think that fairly clearly explains the intent of the code to be based on the base rent.
Thank you very much, Kyle. So unfortunately, our time is up. Thank you very much for everyone for attending our 5th Retail Weekly health check for rent. We'll see you next week with Kyle again. And if I could also, again, encourage all retailers, small, medium and large, please have a look at completing that COVID-19 impact survey. We do need your assistance on this to make sure we can advocate for what is right for you. So thank you very much again, Kyle.
Thanks, Beck. Really appreciate it. Hopefully you're all back next week. I don't know what the topic is yet. If you have issues and concerns, send them through to Beck and we'll try to address them. And whatever's topical next week, we'll cover.
Fantastic. We'll see you all then.
Okay, cheers.